It's not only leaves that cause problems when we have to draw trees. The only reason why branches often don't cause us more trouble is that mercifully they're covered by leaves, but sometimes we end up with a tree where the branches are fairly exposed. And if we're not careful, we end up drawing them in this way. Looking more like some sort of intestinal study, I want to explain now 2 techniques we can use in our drawing of tree branches and trunks to make them look real and come alive. And then I'll redraw this and demonstrate the 2 techniques. The first technique is one that I've certainly mentioned in previous videos and branches, and that's to see the form, not to see the outline. What I did when I drew this was I was looking at the outline of the trunks and I was drawing the outline. But the truth is, unless we both get our outline quite exactly correct and then we align those outlines in the right position, we're going to end up with all sorts of funny, wobbly, lumpy bits where some parts are too thin and other parts look a bit thick. Instead of focusing on outline, we have to see these branches, we have to observe these branches in terms of form. They're round, which is an obvious thing to say, but they're often drawn looking like flat ribbons. So when I'm drawing this, I need to be thinking that this is like a pipe. And according to the angle it follows as it grows, it twists and turns. And sometimes it moves towards me and sometimes it moves away from me. Sometimes it moves overhead. And this can actually distort the proportions at times. I pretend I can slice through my branches and see what the shape is to work out whether I see a circle or whether I see an ellipse at that point. And what I do is, I'm like a plumber imagining the pipe as it goes to capture the twists and the turns. The second technique I use when I'm drawing tree branches and trunks such as this is in my hatching and cross hatching. A general principle I like to follow wherever possible is that I use my hatching to reflect the underlying form. And in this case, I've got 2 directions. I've got the vertical direction, which would certainly be quicker, or I've got the round wrapping around the circular tubular shape of the branches. And this, while it takes a bit longer, certainly creates the sense, the feel that these are round structures, these branches, unlike this vertical hatching, which really helps to flatten the effect. So these are the 2 techniques I'm going to be using as I draw this. The other thing I want to point out is not to think of all of these dark areas as being the same level of darkness, because they're not. Because these curves, some of them loop over the top towards us and some curve away from us, different parts are in deeper shade than others. And some parts also are in shadow as well. So for instance, in here is darker than down here. There is less bouncing light getting to this. Down here is darker than up here. They're both in shade, but there's a different degree. And if we can represent that, then we can also create greater effects to introduce a greater sense of realism. But let's see how I go now putting these 2 techniques into practice. I start by defining the branches. Notice how straight away I redefine my first line there. It's always good to make sure we get the full kink, if you like, into the branch, because those bends really do produce a lot of the visual drama. We don't want to smooth them out or flatten them. Notice I'm not drawing straight lines. I'm not doing smooth edges to these branches because they just don't have them in real life. I mean, this bark is quite rough. We have a very similar branching tree in Sydney called an Angophora, which does have actually quite smooth edges, but this is a rougher bark tree with a similar branching habit. And I want to be able to represent that roughness towards the end. So I don't want to do a straight line that will draw the eye. too much at this point. I'm really wanting to establish where these branches go in relation to each other. I'm partly drawing this by trying to create the negative space, the space between the branches. I'm looking at those and trying to replicate those. And I'm not necessarily going from one place to another. You can see there that I placed that middle branch in first before either top or underneath it were done, because I wanted to make sure that section was in the right position to define that shape. And then I could more easily join it up where I wanted it to go, above and below. So we certainly don't want to start our branches at one point and follow through to the end. They're often a lot less accurate by the time we get to the end if we do that. And notice I repositioned a number of branches there, and just pay attention to those spots at the end. And I promise you'll have no idea that I'd made a mistake. It's certainly worth correcting mistakes at this point, and particularly when we can be confident that we can cover things up, either simply with more line work or with hatching. And I start to put some of the hatching on. Now, it may have looked like I was just doing outlines, but in fact, I was doing those outlines very strongly focused in my head of how the tubes of branch, if you like, were twisting and turning and what section was presenting to me. So because I'd done such careful observation, it was a relatively simple task in this case. And I'm now putting some of that sense of curvature onto the branches that are going to have the most shade on them, the most shadow, the ones where I need the most hatching. I'm not trying to get the final amount of hatching done. I'm really just wanting to establish the direction and get a sense of how it's looking. And I want to work the hatching over basically all the branches that need it, and then I'll fine tune it. Then I'll work out which parts I really do want to make darker and which parts I want to make lighter. But most of the time when I do a section of branch with the hatching, I also make some effort to establish the edge that I would look at. I'm sorry for this shaking. It's the camera holder that seems to pick up the vibrations when I do lots of little fast lines, which unfortunately is all through this. I will have to get something better than what I have. But I work at establishing more finally the edges of the branches, if you like, the bark silhouette. Silhouettes are really important. Our brains get particularly large amounts of information from silhouettes. They're a place that we look at without thinking more quickly than other parts, because they do tell us something about an object. Now, in some of these lower sections that are closer to us, you can see that I'm establishing some of the shadows cast simply by the roughness of the bark rather than the shade on the branches. And it is important that I think when we have a reference, we pay attention to the reference where we put our shade, because that indicates the sun direction, and we want to have a consistency with that. And that also helps tell the observer where branches are twisting in a way that they either catch the sunlight or are shaded from the sunlight from where we're looking at. As you can see, I've also begun to put some leaves in. I didn't want to put too much of the foliage in, and there's not a great deal on this tree anyway. I didn't put the further back foliage in because I wanted this to be about the silhouette of these branches, these twisting and curving branches. And I continue to do the things I talked about in the two techniques. I visualize these twisting pipes to get a strong sense of their form, and that helps me then define their shape, their direction. I do the edges very loosely at first so that I've got plenty of scope to be more accurate in the texture as I finalize where I want those edges to be. and I'm not too fussed with the hatching to do it all at the moment, because I know I'm going to come back over the whole thing and make some parts darker and lighter, and then just a few marks to actually indicate the patterning of the bark that's defined by the shadows that it casts. So taking my work up to the corners, and now as well as these leaves, I'm starting to look more at how much hatching do I want to put, exactly where does it start and stop, and what parts am I thinking need to be made a little bit more dark than I have, noticeably darker. And this is where it's good to stand back and just have a slightly different perspective of our drawing. But basically, these same two principles are at work throughout the whole drawing. I'm observing the reference carefully so that I understand the form, these twisting pipes that sometimes twist back on themselves almost 90 degrees. And then I'm trying to hatch them in a way that emphasizes the twisting, the curvature, the roundness of these branches. This drawing took me 30 minutes to do in real time. And of course, I'll post this reference photo on my channel community page, so you'll be able to have a chance applying these two techniques if you want. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you found this interesting. I hope you find it helpful in drawing trees. They're not as hard as we often think. It's all to do with the way we observe and we think and we understand before we put pen on paper. But look, whatever you draw and however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.